Awesome. All right, we are live. And I am multiple screening, also joining through the app to make sure everything's coming through clearly.
Amen.
And I just want to welcome folks to this session, messaging training, how to fight anti-Semitism in solidarity. My name is Denise. I am a longtime Netroots Nation attendee, volunteer, staff person. I've run a lot of these virtual sessions. I'm really excited to have folks here, and we'll be turning the floor over in a moment to our trainers, but just a few quick housekeeping reminders. As you're coming into the chat, please just let us know who you are, where you're from, what you do. We're excited to have you here. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to add questions. You can also drop those into the chat. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, I'll help the presenters here make sure that we're answering those. This is Netroots Virtual. All of our same community guidelines and ways that we like to treat each other and create space for each other still apply. So please keep that in mind. If you do have any questions or challenges, in the chat, just drop a note. Again, it's Denise. And I'm going to turn the session over now to our trainers. And welcome, everyone. Again, we are in messaging training, how to fight anti-Semitism in solidarity.
Amen. And welcome, everybody. I want to first reaffirm that welcome and thank you so much, Denise, for your support, not just for kind of us right now in this moment, but as you mentioned, kind of your many, many years of support of kind of overall this work and the power of gathering through Netroots. If this is your first time at Netroots, welcome. It's wonderful to be here with you, even if it's through the virtual waves of the internet. I am actually here in person in New Orleans this year, and I'm definitely appreciating so much of the energy of folks coming together right now to try to figure all of this out. So my name is Gray Higgins. It's Gray like the color, although it's certainly not spelled like the color. Couldn't make it that easy. I use he and they pronouns. You can usually find me right now in St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm from and recently returned to. And I come to this work from a deep sense of oftentimes kind of dissatisfaction with the world as it is, and a deep belief that better is possible and that it is ours to do, that no one else is coming to save us, whether earthly or divine. And I believe that world is worth fighting for, is worth getting to know each other and manifesting together. And I'm looking forward to getting to spend some time with you all very briefly this afternoon. Sharon, I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself before we hop in.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Gray, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Sharon Goldsvick. I'm the founder and CEO at Uprise. We are consultants to good guys of all genders, wherever you are in the world, whatever good stuff you are getting up to. And it's been my real honor to work for the last 5 years or so with Ben the Ark and the organizations that are part of the Collaborative for Jewish Organizing on this major narrative intervention into the way that we talk about anti-Semitism. And Gray has been an incredible partner in this work at Ben the Ark. So we're really, really excited to be back here with everybody at Netroots to get to share this with you.
Amen. Amen. And always, of course, a joy to get to work alongside you. So we're going to spend the next like 55-ish minutes kind of like really tackling and grappling a bit about kind of anti-Semitism, how we talk about it, why we should talk about it differently, and ultimately about what this vision of the future that is worth fighting for actually looks like for all of us. So welcome to this message training on how you fight anti-Semitism in solidarity. As we get started, I want to invite you first to think about, and feel free to use this in the chat as you may, when you think about anti-Semitism, what words do you think of? What are the words that come up? Maybe you are a person who spends a lot of time in media spaces, or spends a lot of time on a bunch of email listservs, or you do like I did last night and just kind of Google anti-Semitism to see what's the language frame that oftentimes is coming up when we talk about anti-Semitism. I invite you just to take a moment to think about that. And oftentimes, I hear words, and Sharon, I'm curious about what kind of words you hear as well when we talk about anti-Semitism. But I hear words like there's a big wave coming, or a virus coming, or anti-Semitism has crept in the middle of the night, or has made a home. And it's very Goldilocks-ish. Anti-Semitism has come in the house and is trying all the porridges and is sitting in all the chairs. And I hear that kind of language oftentimes, or that wave language of a typhoon or a tsunami of anti-Semitism coming. But oftentimes I hear that kind of language used when we're talking about anti-Semitism. And of course,
Yeah, totally. Or it's spreading, right? Anti-Semitism is spreading. Hear a lot of that. I hear a lot of the rising tide, and I hear a lot of also just anti-Semitism is on the rise, right? Like it's just out there on its own, rising
mhm,
up.
mhm,
Um, so yeah, it's this kind of language. When I first started looking into this issue, and when I first started, researching anti-Semitism, that kind of language was so pervasive that I
mhm,
actually couldn't find any examples where people were talking or writing about anti-Semitism and they weren't using that kind
mhm,
of language. It was absolutely pervasive.
mhm. And there's something both the anti-Semitism as like this kind of microscopic viral kind of thing that is felt but not seen, but also this kind of giant force that comes into a room all at the same time. We'll get a little bit into it, of course, in our presentation, but holding something
Yeah.
about, and I'd invite folks in the audience to think about as well, right, is that the words that we use, the language, the message, the frame, not only helps us understand what the problem is, the boundaries of it, and what we think are the causes, but certainly also shines certain pathways to solutions. And so we'll
Yeah.
talk a little bit as well about kind of what are the bad solutions that we are getting right now. Right. All right. Should we jump into it?
Let's do it.
Wonderful. All right. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, first and foremost, this is not a training that is about kind of the definition. And while I think there's lots of good work and necessity of work around really wrestling with the definition, whether that's through a policy lens or an academic lens or a functional lens, right? I think we work from a framework that says that anti-Semitism, and it's kind of most where we're coming from, is essentially a system of ideas based on white supremacy and European Christian hegemony, passed down through a society's institutions to enable the scapegoating of Jews and the ideological or physical targeting of Jews that results from that. When we say society's institutions, we mean the institutions of, kind of culture, right? Whether that's through media and storytelling, or kind of how we are in relationship to time. We also mean that in terms of things about the built environment. We mean that about educational institutions and through economy. We generally mean through the kind of structures that we have inherited from this kind of white supremacist European Christian hegemonic worldview and world building project that, for lots of reasons, we are kind of still in. And anti-Semitism functions as a part of that broader machinery. So you're going to hear us talk a lot about kind of machinery as a way to both understand anti-Semitism, but also to understand this bigger set of societal institutions, the way they work together, and kind of what are they putting out there in the world. And as I said before, just again, when we think about all these different kinds of language, right? So Sharon, your point of kind of being able to see this moment in time and history of discussion of anti-Semitism, the way that this language gets used, that it's a deadly virus, not just a virus, but it is a deadly virus, right? And there's so much I think that does to us in terms of activates our sense of fear, our sense of collective demand for safety, for protection, whether it is from a deadly virus or a big wave, or all these other things, and the ways in which anti-Semitism is kind of encroached upon us in many ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when we think about the metaphoric language that we use, as you said, Gray, it really deeply influences the way that we think about the issues.
Mhm,
So it not only shapes the way we understand understand the nature of those issues, but it also shapes the way we see that those problems can be solved. And there's lots and lots of research about this. We're not going to go into detail to back that up, but there's a reason that, for people who work in narrative strategy like me, one of the things that we often look at if we're trying to figure out why a certain conversation isn't working or is getting stuck in certain ways, we look at the metaphoric language that's being used. And like I said earlier, when I first started looking into anti-Semitism, these two metaphors, the water metaphor and the disease or the virus metaphor, were so pervasive that I could not find a single example of speech or text, writing or talking about anti-Semitism that didn't use one or both, sometimes in a pretty spectacularly mashed up fashion. And I always kind of warn people when we do this part of the presentation that it's one of those things that, like, once you see it, you can never really unsee it. And you're going to start, if you haven't heard this before, you're going to start seeing these metaphors kind of all over the place. And what these metaphors do is they give us a cognitive map for understanding what do we think is important to know about anti-Semitism. So we have the water metaphor, which sounds like anti-Semitism comes in waves or it's on the rise. Or my personal favorite, we have to push back against the rising tide of anti-Semitism. And I just love this one because it's so evocative, right? It's like I always just imagine myself on the beach and there's a tide the tide is coming in, right? Like the water is rising and I'm about to be knocked over or drowned in it. And what am I going to do against that? I am going to push it back. And what's so striking about this is, like, it's so obvious to me and to everybody else who's listening that is not going to work, right? We are not going to be able to push back. Like, what are we supposed to do? Lasso the moon? Like, I don't know. That sounds like some Elon Musk bullshit to me, but I don't think that that's going to work. So our other metaphor is the disease or the virus metaphor. And that sounds like, anti-Semitism has infected college campuses, or sometimes our body politic, right? Or saying this person is a virulent anti-Semite, as if it's something that's inside of them or something that's a personal trait. Either you are or you aren't, right? And sometimes we talk about spreading anti-Semitism, right? Like if you come into contact with someone who's got this infection inside of them, then it's going to spread. And what we know about what these metaphors do in terms of how they help us to understand or don't help us to understand, what they cause us to understand about this issue, is that anti-Semitism is a part of nature. It wasn't created by people. And when it's not created by people, you can't then offer people that there's any kind of solution that can come from people, right? So already, just on its very, very most basic level, we're basically saying, especially in the case of the water metaphor, that we cannot imagine the world without anti-Semitism in it. And I want to just ask us all to pause for a second and really consider what that means, right? If we can't actually imagine a world without anti-Semitism, then why would anybody do anything about it? Like, what would be the point, right? So we're starting out already from this place of, this is not a problem we can solve. It is a part of nature, so, don't even bother. And it's very, very scary. And what we know that happens when people are exposed to fear is that it makes them more conservative, right? If we don't feel like this is a problem we can solve, especially when Jewish folks, when we feel like, we are never going to be able to escape this. We cannot imagine a world without it. That makes us afraid, right? Like whatever kind of identity you hold, if you have no way to imagine a world that is accepting, welcoming, and doesn't persecute you for that identity, you are going to be living in fear. We all do. And so the more we reinforce that fear, the more what it does is actually make us more conservative. And this is also something that's been studied by political psychologists and cognitive psychologists very extensively. What fear does in our brains is it makes us attuned to threat. It makes us less likely to trust people who are outside of the group of folks that we identify as similar to us. And it makes it almost impossible to engage in higher order reasoning that's required for things like imagining a different future, taking action steps towards that future. Critical thinking skills. It sort of short circuits all of that. And there's a reason that we have that from our evolution as a species. But when we're talking about, how we talk about anti-Semitism and how we message on anti-Semitism, it is really important that we understand that when we use these metaphors, and I just want to say, like, I've done it. Gray's done it, like we've all done it. So this is a no shame zone around these bad metaphors. But what we do want to say now is that now that we have this understanding of just how damaging those are, we always recommend against using any of this language ever to talk about anti-Semitism. And that goes for even slightly more abstract things like anti-Semitism is on the rise, or just saying like rising anti-Semitism. It's not happening on its own. It's not a part of a tide, right? It's not happening because of the moon. It's happening because of people and the actions of humans. And we have to constantly make that apparent, or any solution that we offer is going to be very obvious that we're just trying to push back a tide.
Really appreciate that. Like, also, it's the language of tide is the control of the moon. And I think there's just something about coming back to that reminder. I was recently on the West Coast, and definitely that sense of like tide and the water coming up, and just feeling in my body how goofy a pursuit that would have felt. Be like, no, water, don't come near me in that kind of way. Right. And we know, of course, that these language frames, of course, like lead us, as you mentioned, to a certain kind of set of solutions and things like that, while also kind of, short circuiting some of our, our problem solving skills in many ways when fear gets activated. We know that, you've kind of, the thing you've really kind of offered in so much of this conversation also is the shift in metaphor and moving towards this machinery metaphor. So if we can get into that a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about this machinery metaphor, if it's not nature, if it's not from the moon, or if it's not from, it's not of the earth, let's get into what it's all about.
Yeah. So the machinery metaphor that we offer, if you can't use the bad metaphors, I'm sorry, that's getting rid of a lot of the language that a lot of us use. We don't want to leave you with nothing. Here's something that you can use instead. And we're going to give a lot more examples of how you can use this metaphoric language. So if you want to say the machinery metaphor explicitly, that sounds like anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear used for specific material or political gain. So what do we get when we think about anti-Semitism as part of this machinery, as opposed to, a tide, a wave, a disease, a virus? Well, we get that it was built by people for a specific purpose. You don't build a machine unless you have a reason to do so. You also get that anybody can fuel it, right? Anybody could potentially fuel a machine, but it's those that built it and that use it who are responsible for it. And those are the people that benefit from it. And we'll talk a little bit about this idea of using versus fueling a little bit later, but this is a really, really important linguistic tool for us to use, and especially important for folks to understand within our progressive movement that allows us to take anti-Semitism seriously, correct mistakes, missteps, misunderstandings when they happen, and they do. Let's not pretend like that's not true. And also not take the bait of allowing folks to feel like this is an absolute equivalent. It's not political at all. It doesn't, it's not connected to any political movement, or it's connected as much to the political left as it is to the right, or in the same ways, which is also not true. We get from this metaphor that we can absolutely stop a machine. There's no reason that any particular machine has to exist in the world. And we also see anti-Semitism as directly connected to a larger whole, directly connected to other problems, and that its solution has to be with that in mind, that the solution to anti-Semitism is also directly connected to other forms of oppression. We always say to people, and I would say to everybody here, that we can't solve anti-Semitism without solving anti-Black racism, without solving transphobia and homophobia, without solving anti-immigrant xenophobia, and many, many other things. We cannot solve anti-immigrant xenophobia, anti-trans hatred, anti-Black racism without also solving anti-Semitism. They are directly connected to each other. And Gray's going to go into a lot more detail about how clearly we are seeing that right now, because it is very, very stark. But that idea that these things are connected from the start, and that the solutions are connected, is fundamentally important. We talk about and we named this session "How to Fight Anti-Semitism in Solidarity." And one of the most important things to me about solidarity is about being able to locate ourselves in other people's stories, and to find our own personal connection to that, right? And so that is what we are asking all kinds of folks to do, whether you're Jewish or not, is understand how anti-Semitism is actually your story too, and how it's directly connected to your work, to the other issues that you work on, to your personal life. As a Jew, I want to say that, like, I'm very happy for people to, show up for me, as a Jew, by confronting anti-Semitism and trying to end it, because you want to be a good person, and that's something that good people do. I am even more impressed if you are able to articulate the way that anti-Semitism is directly connected to yourself and your life if you're not Jewish. That shows me that you actually really understand that our futures are bound to each other, and that we don't have a choice but to be in this together. And that is incredibly impressive, and something that you can communicate and show. And that's really, really, really effective and really persuasive when we do that.
Amen. I think there's just something also in that very practical sense of what it looks like to be, fighting in the terrain of now, but certainly contending for the future, and knowing that kind of authoritarians, fascists, they have a very clear vision of the future right now,
Yeah.
that they are kind of welcoming people into. And they've done this like really tricky bit where they're both moving a kind of multiracial visage of a future. But so there's so many layers right now to how do we understand the ways in which all of this machinery is working together right now. So I know we had a couple more slides on the metaphor, and so I don't know if you wanted to stay there, if we want to get into a little bit more of how the machinery works and how these different kinds of things are working together.
Yeah, let's do some really practical languagey stuff, and then we're going to zoom out again for a second, just because we've just introduced this concept. So,
Yep.
So how do you use the machinery metaphor? You don't have to go around saying anti-Semitism is part of the division, the machinery of division and fear that some politicians use for specific political or material gain. You can say that if you can remember it. Took me a long time to remember it, and I wrote it. So you don't have to say it. You can. But there are lots of other ways to be, just like, in the water metaphor, we don't always say anti-Semitism is water. What we say is there's a wave of anti-Semitism, or a rising tide of anti-Semitism. So here's how you use the machinery metaphor in that sense. The first way to do it is to talk about anti-Semitism always as an object, not as an actor. That means that anti-Semitism does not have agency. Anti-Semitism does not do things, right? Anti-Semitism is not like out there on the streets, getting a job and a cell phone plan, right? Anti-Semitism is used by people. So you could say, instead of anti-Semitism is making us afraid, right? You could say politicians who rely on division and fear for their power use anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is something to be used. Second way is to talk about the effects of anti-Semitism and who benefits from those outcomes. Again, making sure that there are human actors in the story that you're telling about anti-Semitism. So you might say this specific person is using anti-Semitism to generate fear and divide us against each other. That is within the machinery metaphor frame. You're talking about anti-Semitism as generating something, and specifically generating fear and division. And again, you can differentiate between using and fueling anti-Semitism, right? Because as we've said, anybody could fuel anti-Semitism, but it's the people who benefit from anti-Semitism that are the ones that are using it. It is deliberate, it is unapologetic, it is not a mistake or a misstep or a misunderstanding, right? But it's also really important to understand that mistakes and missteps and misunderstandings can actually really hurt us, because fueling that machine means it's not only fueling, targeting Jews, it's fueling that connected machinery that's targeting all of us. And that's, that goes back to this idea of really seeing ourselves as connected to each other, whether you're Jewish or not, understanding the role that anti-Semitism plays in your own life, in your own work, and in your vision for the future, to Gray's point. The last way, and I'm not going to talk about this one too much, but it's another interesting way to use the machinery metaphor. When you're talking about things like tropes, stereotypes, biases, prejudices, right? Which, as we know, is one part of anti-Semitism, but not all of it. Think about that, and you can talk about that like pollution that is pumped into our society. So you might say something like, I grew up hearing really noxious stories about Jewish people. And actually they're not true, right? So think about it like pollution, talk about it like pollution, right? There's no reason that pollution has to exist, but it is something that is around and that most of us will internalize in some way, and that we need to be conscious of, and that requires cleaning up, right? So that's very, very much within the machinery metaphor frame. So let's talk about some additional languaging do's and don'ts. And we're going to get to this. Some of this is some of my most controversial. Okay, let's talk about some of the things to say and some of the things to not say it, right? So always talk about anti-Semitism as a political tool. Never talk about it like it's nature, right? So we've talked about that pretty extensively. And talk about what anti-Semitism is used for. It is used to generate division and fear. Definitely avoid saying that anti-Semitism is a form of hate. Now, the problem, this is controversial, because I know we shorthand a lot of oppressive systems as hatred. And certainly those systems do involve hatred. That's not true. But if we talk about them in that way, if we talk about them as forms of hatred, and especially if we exclusively talk about them as forms of hatred, what happens is that people think that it's about a feeling that you have towards somebody, which allows someone to say, well, I don't have any interpersonal animus towards this nice Jewish guy I know called Gray Hagans, so I must not be an anti-Semite, so this must not be my problem. Now, of course, that is truly, truly not how it works. But when we talk about oppression as hatred, that's what we are giving people. So avoid that language. We're giving the advice to avoid that language about anti-Semitism, although, to be honest with you, it's something that I really think we should avoid in talking about oppressions in general. We should talk about someone using anti-Semitism for their own political, material, or spiritual gain. We should not talk about whether someone is or isn't an anti-Semite, right? Talking about anti-Semitism as a binary personal trait, again, just reinforces this idea that it's about what's in someone's heart, or, something that can spread to other people, or something that you can't really recover from. And this doesn't help us make the case that anti-Semitism is connected to other oppressions and something that we can do something about. And finally, always use anti-Semitism as object. People can use or fuel anti-Semitism. Never, ever use language that talks about anti-Semitism as agent. I want to add one more in here. This is a spicy one. There's a phrase that's going around that's called weaponization of anti-Semitism. And here's what I want to tell you about this phrase. Whenever somebody uses this phrase, they are convinced that they know what it means. I have done this training to thousands of people over the last several years. I ask rooms full of people that you would really expect to know what that phrase means, whether they believe that they know what it means. 10 to 15% of people believe that they know what weaponization of anti-Semitism means. It is a jargon term. People don't know what the hell we're talking about. But there's an even bigger problem with weaponization of anti-Semitism, and that is weaponization means turning something that wasn't a weapon into a weapon. And part of what we are saying, and part of what is true about anti-Semitism, is that it is always a weapon. It has always been a weapon, right? It's not incidental. It didn't occur naturally. It has actually always been a weapon. So when we talk about weaponization of anti-Semitism as one instance And usually if you don't know what it is, right, because we just established we don't actually all know what it is. Usually when people use that phrase, what they're referring to is when people use an accusation of anti-Semitism, which is usually not true or exaggerated, to attack someone in order to smear them, right? Create a political liability for somebody. And very, very often, this is a strategy that the right wing uses towards progressives, towards progressive women, towards progressive women of color, towards progressive Muslim women of color. As you go more and more, that threat becomes bigger and bigger. We do have other language that you can use. We are going to get to it, I promise. But I really want to encourage us to lose it. I always say to avoid the language of weaponization of anti-Semitism. There are other ways that we can make that point that actually makes it clear without undercutting what we believe is true about anti-Semitism in general and this bigger picture narrative that we're trying to communicate. Some people have tried to solve that by saying instrumentalization of anti-Semitism. I got to tell you, I hate that even more just because it's longer. And because, again, it doesn't solve the problem. Anti-Semitism is already an instrument. It's already an instrument. Does not solve the problem. So don't think you can get around it that way either. Okay, that is all my little word nerd stuff for the moment. I'm going to hand it back to you, Gray, to go in deeper about how exactly does this machine work? If we're offering this machinery metaphor, let's share some rigor here about how actually we think this works.
Yes. And one, I want to say I appreciate the word nerd stuff, right? Because it really does get at some of when we say that, our words create worlds, or at bare minimum, our words create a context for what we understand as the problem, right? And so to your point of when we use the language of weaponization, we're also kind of reaffirming what you named earlier at the beginning of our conversation about the ways in which kind of these metaphors of nature kind of lead us to think that this is a naturally occurring phenomenon that is both inevitable and eternal. And in the Jewish tradition, we said there's a set of teachings that there's a set of things that are created for the creation of the world. And it kind of reaffirms this sense of like anti-Semitism is such the oldest form of oppression. It was created before let there be light. Right. And that the problem right now is just the weaponization of this thing, as opposed to, the problem is the thing. It's the machinery. It is that it is a current, right? And so when we think about this machinery and how that machinery works, right, we understand that anti-Semitism, again, was created to protect people in power by shifting blame for society's problems to Jews, Jewish people, Jewish communities, Jewish identity, especially during moments of social change or unrest. Another way to say that is that anti-Semitism emerged as a mechanism in that context of white supremacist Christian hegemonic world and empire building as a way to protect against that kind of consolidation of resources and power, both by kind of giving a convenient set of people to turn, popular resentment towards when the time was necessary. Not because it's natural, but because when your plan is to exploit people, you need a way out when people turn around and go, we don't like to be exploited. Because human nature is actually anti-oppression, anti-exploitation, anti-colonial. I actually firmly do believe that. Right. And so this operates in this kind of way around turning that kind of animus, or, we used to say it was kind of like a release valve for the kind of steam, the kind of pressure when we're in exploitative contexts right now. It's like, where do you turn that? And so anti-Semitism in this particular part of the machinery fits alongside this larger set of historic and present structures of exploitation and oppression. Right. And when we think, again, I want to say one thing real quick about that using fueling thing as well that I've been sitting and wrestling with, that I think we all have to figure out how to hold, is the part about fueling is about kind of system maintenance, right? It's a part of what kind of allows the system to, in those times in which we're not in social unrest, right? It's kind of the thing that kind of keeps the system oiled and ready to go for when this happens, right? It's the kind of ways in which it lives kind of in our culture and our conversations. It's oftentimes the ways in which we don't, kind of reflectively question things, or we just kind of let them keep going, and it creates a container in which, I mean, we've seen lots of this in online spaces, in which it maintains the space for the right to be able to co-opt and infiltrate and build their movements and their ideology in our spaces, right? And part of it is because of that kind of unexplored kind of ways in which this also kind of comes through us, in which many of us also find ourselves accidentally fueling this system as well. And this is true in different ways and different mechanisms of the machinery. To Sharon's point, across xenophobia and anti-Black racism and transphobia, like it lives in different kinds of ways, right? But particularly anti-Semitism as a structure, right, really kind of lives in this place where it keeps, again, that those wheels of economic oppression and exploitation hidden from view. It kind of creates the phenomenon of the kind of ever-present set of interests. And while I do believe, right, that there are a set of people, oftentimes whom we do not know all of their names, right? Who are the folks who are the top billionaires, and now apparently Musk is about to be a trillionaire. Um, that there is a small set of people. That small set of people are not a bunch of Jewish people, actually. And so often, what anti-Semitism does, kind of in just the way it lives in our analyses and our cultural being, and the way that we fuel it, oftentimes is some of this. I used to do in some of my trainings, I would ask the question around, billionaires and millionaires and folks, and who do you think those people are? And more often than not, people would name people that they thought were Jewish. Some of those people were Jewish. Many of those people were not Jewish. But there's a way in which we've kind of, in some ways, gotten uh, lazy almost in our understanding of, yes, there is a set of interests, and no, it is not a secret Jewish cabal, actually. And those things are not one and the same, right? But the function of anti-Semitism in this machinery is to obscure class and caste and racial oppression, to make it also look normal, to make it look like it's a part of nature, to actually obscure that a machine is actually in movement, right? And it does that, again, by claiming that there's some set of Jews or Jewish actors or people that are behind the curtain controlling these levers of power. Sometimes they're nameless, sometimes they're named. And again, this is part of this function of oftentimes people, in my experience, when you say name some billionaires, right, oftentimes think the people they're talking about are Jewish when in fact they're not. Right? Because actually anti-Semitism is the curtain. It is the thing that oftentimes is kind of making other things more possible, particularly the context in which we are in right now. Right.
And
So
can I just add, Gray, I mean, it's
please.
such an important point. And I just want to say, in terms of language,
Mhm.
like this often can present a problem for, folks who are trying to message on class, right? Like, how do you message on class without
Mhm.
falling into the trap of
Mhm.
just recycling that actually are anti-Semitic stories or stereotypes or tropes, but to actually make a class analysis that is real and true. And I just want to acknowledge that, because it is tough, right? Like,
Mhm.
when our wealth is so concentrated in late stage capitalism among so few people,
Mhm.
there is language that we often use in class analysis that can trigger and evoke anti-Semitic tropes. And this is why, I mean, there's not like a simple easy fix for that,
Mhm.
um, because of all of the dynamics that you've just laid out.
Mhm.
So that's part of the reason why we think it's so important for folks to
Mhm.
understand more, so that you
Yeah.
can employ sensitivity and nuance in the language that you use, so that you are not, inadvertently reinforcing these stories that are really, really dangerous.
Yes. And like I think part of that, like, one of Gray's controversial takes is some of the language of during the Occupy movement of the 99% and the 1%. Well, I think there was some like great messaging and like what that communicated. Some of the, if we look back at like why was that good popular messaging? Why did that help people understand something about the kind of chasm of capitalism right now? And I think
Yeah.
there's, in my experience, there's something about because it shortcuts a certain set of things, right? Racism and misogyny, all those kinds of things are also cognitive shortcuts for us. And so there's ways that we think about like anti-Semitism as a cognitive and analysis shortcut sometimes. And the world I think we are seeking to build is not one that actually is built by cutting corners. So I think there's something about, rigor and commitment towards what is more possible means also taking these things seriously. Again, part of it is the right-wing actors, like actual Nazis, are like building platforms and moving their messaging in many ways through other kinds of spaces because these things go unchallenged or unchecked in there. And so they sound pretty reasonable until they start
So
going,
true.
come over here and check out the rest of what I have to say. So like when we're talking about like why this is so critical right now, there's like that set of things, but then there is also the world in which we're watching, kind of fascism and authoritarianism as a consolidated response to the crises of their time. And when we talk about anti-Semitism in these kind of ways, to your point earlier, that trigger fear, right? But then leave people kind of in this activated space when someone comes forward and says that they have a solution that, contains the problem, right? Through different mechanisms. So they have a solution that preemptively, solves the problem and or kind of creates new categories of thought crimes and, political vision and thought crimes and things like that,
Yep.
that feels kind of nurturing to the nervous system sometimes, but actually what it looks like, of course, is things like, things that are being moved through the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther and that are being moved right now through the Trump administration, and the ways in which we're seeing kind of the targeting of students and nonprofits and Palestinian Americans and activists and immigrants and Muslim communities and trans folks and et cetera, and doing so in the name of protecting Jewish people and fighting anti-Semitism. We see them using and consolidating kind of the the police state and the intelligence state, kind of bringing those things together to actually now investigate students and professors and blocking student visas and pulling research funding from universities, and talking about a number of mechanisms right now that are eroding civil liberties and protections, that are actually eroding democratic practice, and are also eroding our sense of trust and commitment to one another oftentimes, right? Because it's seen as like a problem that gets solved over there. And we see it coming through really, really strongly in terms of this administration's kind of immigration approach right now. So I was going to play just a quick 1-minute clip. This is from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service's first 100 days accomplishments video. This is from the federal government of the United States, which right now is on a level of absurdity I think many of us didn't think we would be in living reality of. So just contextually, it's one of the many moments of something happening right now. But I want to play this very quickly.
Fighting anti-Semitism. In support of President Trump's executive orders on combating anti-Semitism, additional measures to combat anti-Semitism, and protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats, USCIS has begun screening the social media accounts of aliens seeking immigration benefits for anti-Semitic activity. USCIS is committed to using every tool available to us to protect the homeland from extremists and terrorist aliens, including those who support anti-Semitic terrorism, violent anti-Semitic ideologies, and anti-Semitic terrorist organizations. For more information, visit uscis.gov.
So just using the like the homeland language, right? Using language that comes straight out of like a Nazi authoritarian playbook, while saying that in order to protect the homeland, we must use the intelligence system, the carceral system, the military, our technology, etc. Right? Those things don't quite match in many ways, right? But they do match again when we understand that anti-Semitism is a part of this machinery, that the purpose is actually division and fear for the sake of this kind of right-wing consolidation in that kind of ways, right? Is, as you would call it, smokescreen anti-Semitism, not weaponization or instrumental. That word very gives how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. But we talk about smokescreen anti-Semitism, right? That this is the thing that we are watching happening right now. This consolidation of authoritarian power in the United States and the movement of this kind of authoritarian frankly, white Christian nationalist vision of the world. By kind of using anti-Semitism in this way, right? Using this kind of dual set of strategies of kind of the increase of racialized fear and division, right? Kind of directly blaming failures by offering Jews as a scapegoat for the problem, while then also offering to Jewish folks who are afraid that everyone else is a scapegoat for the problem, right? It's kind of the switcheroo of just it's them, it's them, it's them, it's them, while the people who are actually moving things kind of are able to stand back like this and go, wow, you all really seem unhinged, and we need to come back hard and get things back together, right? But this is all about building power and winning elections and advancing this authoritarian and undemocratic agenda in many ways, right? And that second part is, again, that pointing the finger at other people and saying, right, that these other people are unsafe. And of course, that is all built on kind of the machinery of anti-Black racism, of queer phobia, of Islamophobia, of anti-Palestinian racism, of all of these other kinds of things. So we already have this baseline of the kind of noxious gases and smogs from the machinery that already have kind of created this environment of kind of mistrust and fear in many ways. And so it's built on top of that, meant to activate those things, again, for the kind of purpose of consolidation of power in that way. But fear plays such a core part of this. So when we talk about language and that attention to fear, I don't know if that's where you were about to go, because that's where our slide deck is about to go.
Yeah, I know. No, I was just going to say another thing about smokescreen anti-Semitism. We're offering this, as language that is useful. And it's not useful if you just say it because people, it's not really readily apparent what it means. But if you say, in the case of that ICE video that we just watched, right? Mm-hmm. This is the Trump administration using anti-Semitism as a smokescreen to enact a regressive agenda that hurts all of us. That's very clear what that means, right? And they are, right? So they're using this idea that they are the real defenders of Jews as a smokescreen, as a shield, to shield them from accountability for all of the really, really bad, fucked up shit that they're doing, which, by the way, hurts Jewish people too. And it's another way of moving Jewish folks into that curtain position, right? Into that masking position. Oh, well, the reason we have to screen people's social media accounts is because of the Jews, right? Like in this case, it's for the benefit of, but it doesn't matter, right? The point is that we're positioned as the reason. That's a core part of smokescreen anti-Semitism, and something that is really important to note when you see it, right? Now, I should also say that sometimes smokescreen anti-Semitism, like sometimes the things that are being done, like they might actually be legitimately things that could be helpful to Jewish folks, but if they are being done to be used as a smokescreen to cover up from someone's malfeasance, whatever that is, whether it's the anti-Semitism that they're using in their campaign ads to get more votes and win elections, or if it's advancing other parts of their authoritarian agenda, you can't then say, oh, but we are the party that is the true defenders of Jews, or we personally as politicians are the real defenders of Jews. You have to be able to identify that as a smokescreen anti-Semitism attack.
Should we get into the fear machine?
Let's talk about the fear machine. Let's talk about it. So I hope that what we've shared has sort of created a real sense that the language that we use matters. It really, really does. When it comes to anti-Semitism, the language that we use matters so much. And so we want to offer some principles for talking about anti-Semitism. The first is that you have to always talk about anti-Semitism like it's a problem we can solve, right? Otherwise, we will forever be standing on the beach trying to push back the tide, right? And we know that that's not going to work. We have to talk about how anti-Semitism is being used to deflect blame from those in power, remove fundamental freedoms, weaken democracy, advance an authoritarian agenda. I think Gray has made that case very, very clearly, and there's not much more that needs to be said about that. But the ways that we talk about anti-Semitism can really interrupt these patterns. And in order to do that, we have to tell a complete story that shows that actually we understand what anti-Semitism is. It is important to us. We take it seriously. We are the ones who have the solution to anti-Semitism and to the whole connected array of problems that we see working together. This idea that words create worlds that Gray invoked earlier, which is something that comes from Jewish tradition, they really do shape our reality, right? The words that we use shape our reality. So we're gonna go to the next slide. I want to say one thing first. Everything that we're sharing with you today, other than the very topical like things that that Gray clipped from the news this morning or yesterday or whatever, all of those things exist in our Dismantling Anti-Semitism message guide, which is on the Netroots app as an attachment to this session. It is also available at dismantlingantisemitism.org, and I think somebody will drop that in the chat for us if you go to download links. So the next thing I'm going to share with you is the message platform. This is sort of like the core of what we're offering to you. And I don't want you to feel like you need to remember it or screenshot it or like write it down right now, because it's all in the guide. And we are really, really happy for you to use this. Crib from it, copy from it, use it. Like the more people do that, actually, the more we have folks copying and pasting this language and using it to talk about anti-Semitism, the stronger this new narrative becomes, and the more we are able to actually fundamentally shift the way people understand anti-Semitism and what we're prepared to do about it. And in particular, the more we are able to do that working together. So I am going to read the message platform, and I invite you to just listen to it. And I want you to think about how this message platform makes you feel, right? Really see if you can sort of home in on how you are feeling. I'm also going to say some words that are from the perspective of a Jewish person, because I am a Jewish person that is reading this. If you are not Jewish and you want to use this message platform, all you need to do is change the words that are in brackets. So either omit them or change them accordingly, according to your own identity. This is still for you, very, very, very much so. So I don't want to give you the impression that it's not. So here we go. Most of us believe that every person, no matter our religion, where we come from, or what we look like, deserves to live with freedom, safety, and belonging. As Jews, we know that whether we're walking down the streets of our neighborhoods or through the doors of our holy spaces, freedom and safety for any of us depends on the freedom and safety of all of us. But there are some politicians who seek to build a country that's only for themselves and people like them, exploiting divisions between us and making us afraid while they hoard power and wealth. As Jews, we know how dangerous this is. When politicians target Jewish people and blame us for hard times, it leads directly to violence against us. Anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear those politicians rely on for power. The same machinery those politicians use to blame Black and brown people, people who are immigrants, people who are Muslim, and more. But whether they manufacture division or fear based on our religion, our skin color, or how long we've been here, their goal is to keep us from working together to win the things we all need to thrive. When Jewish people join together with our neighbors across difference, as we have in the past, we can shut down the fear factory and protect each other. We'll show up for each other every time one of us is targeted because of our differences, and reject any politician who uses fear to divide us against each other. Together, we can build a country that fulfills the promise of freedom and safety for all of us, no exceptions. If you would like, please feel free to share with us in the chat how you feel after hearing this, as opposed to maybe how you felt hearing some of the headlines that Gray read before, thinking about that water metaphor, thinking about the virus or disease metaphor. I'd love to hear it. Oftentimes people tell us that this makes them feel empowered, connected. I joke sometimes that this is like the only training about anti-Semitism you'll ever go to and feel better at the end than you did when you started. But that's really what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to give people a different emotional experience of this so that we're not just stuck in fear, right? Which requires us to acknowledge that things really are bad, but not leave us there, right? Like not leave us stranded there. There's lots and lots more in the message guide about this platform, about the individual pieces of it. If you're familiar with the race-class narrative, this is built on race-class narrative infrastructure. as I'm sure you'll have noticed if you were listening to the message platform. Let's dive into a couple of specifics about the language, which we promised earlier. So we talked before about this idea that of using versus fueling anti-Semitism. So let me break that down for you in a little bit more detail. So somebody can use anti-Semitism. They're using anti-Semitism when it's deliberate, it serves their purposes, and they benefit from it, right? That's a person who is using anti-Semitism. An individual or a group of people is fueling anti-Semitism when they say or do something anti-Semitic, but they don't necessarily benefit from it. So this could be a mistake, a misstep, a misunderstanding, a misconception, but they are not using this for any kind of political or material gain. They have said something for, any of those reasons. Now, the important thing about this is that using and fueling are both bad. Fueling anti-Semitism is not okay. It's never okay. And we never, ever want people to do it, right? We really, really, really encourage you. And in fact, part of the purpose of seeing fueling for what it is to help us understand, and especially our progressive movement understand, just how dangerous it is when we make missteps, mistakes, miscommunications about anti-Semitism. It's more than an ouch. It can really cause, serious damage to our movements, to Jewish people, to Jewish communities. It's really, really, really important not to fuel that machine, which ultimately is hurting all of us. So this is not any kind of a get off scot-free card. What it is, though, is an ability to differentiate between somebody who is using anti-Semitism deliberately and someone who isn't. And that is an important thing for us to be able to do. It also gives us the opportunity to say when we've made a mistake, because that's an important thing, right? Like, we all need to be able to do that. And we have to be able to do that without buying into the right-wing narrative about anti-Semitism, which says that, progressives and people of color in particular are particularly to blame for anti-Semitism. And we can do that too. We can acknowledge when we have made a mistake or a misstep without buying wholly into that very, very wrong and very harmful narrative. I want to, Gray, since we're almost out of time, I think I want to skip our last slide and just go to talk very briefly about how we dismantle anti-Semitism. So we'll just skip the next one. Great. So in our guide, we offer a way to actually think about how we can end anti-Semitism. This is kind of a bold thing, I have to say. And I was a little scared of suggesting it. But if we say as a progressive movement that we are the ones that have the keys to ending anti-Semitism, I think we actually have to show that we do. And so what we're offering here is how we actually think anti-Semitism gets ended. And that's these 8 steps. Number 1, learn about anti-Semitism. You can't end something if you don't know what it's about and you don't understand it. Number 2 is to unlearn it, right? We are all exposed to those noxious stories about anti-Semitism in different ways. It's our responsibility to unlearn them. Just like we have to unlearn patriarchy and racism and homophobia and transphobia and all the other things that we are handed from the society that we're born into. Find yourself and your personal stake in the story, as we've discussed, whether you're Jewish or not, and articulate and work towards a future of freedom and safety for Jewish people and for all of us, which means explicitly naming Jews in that story. Don't be afraid to do that. And don't do it only when you've been accused of anti-Semitism either. Like, the time to do it is actually all the time. Respond appropriately to anti-Semitism when it happens. We've got more in the guide about that. Respond appropriately to smokescreen anti-Semitism, as we've talked about. Reject any effort, policy, or leader that weakens multiracial democracy or our fundamental freedoms. We have to understand that those things are not helping solve anti-Semitism. In fact, they are exacerbating the problem. And finally, and maybe most importantly, keep showing up together and refuse to be divided. When Jews are split off from the progressive movement, when Jewish people are not present, we cannot be whole as a progressive movement. Right? We cannot be whole as a future that we actually want. So be very, very wary of that. And don't buy into the idea that we are going to solve this apart, because we're not. Keep showing up, refuse to be divided against each other.
And to that, Sharon, all I can say is amen. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for learning with us. As Sharon mentioned, you can definitely find the guide in the app, as well as you can check out the guide on dismantlingantisemitism.org. You can also find out more about how to get in touch with us. If you're like, oh, I really would love to have more of a training, I'm really more curious about this work, you'll definitely on the website find contact information and ways to connect both to Sharon at Uprise, doing, kind of the comms work for the good guys, and also for Bend the Arc Jewish Action as well, about what it looks like to be organizing kind of progressive American Jews towards this broader vision of solidarity, so that we can actually fight for the future that we all deserve and wrestle it back from fascists who unfortunately have a very different vision for what all of this can look like. And thank you all for taking your time with us this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Grace, so much for being here. Thank you, Netroots, for having us.
Amen.
Ooh, Denise, we can't hear you.
Thank you, Gray. I know you're running to your next session. And I did drop the link in the chat. It's attached to the session in the app. And then Sharon and Gray, I also invite you just to send along any additional materials if you want to include anything else for folks to be able to reference. Thank you all for your time. And Gray, deep appreciation running back to back.
Amen. Thank you all.
Have a great time in
all.
New Orleans. Thanks, everybody.
Amen.
Bye, everybody.
Net rooting. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, sure.
Bye.
Bye.